isn't it?
I think so, yeah. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us online. We'll just be another minute or two. So Kerry, if you could just be about 1.5 feet taller, that would be lovely.
Do you want me to stand on the chair?
There we go. Okay, so I'll introduce you and then I'll hand over. I'll pop them up.
Okay. So that the other speaker will be in the corner, will she?
Yes, let's do that. Let's go for a dual junction.
I see. So she can be on one and the PowerPoint on the other. Is that the idea?
That is the idea, but it doesn't seem to be doing that. Okay. Well, like
You're speaking first, though, right, Kerry?
We've got sound sort of, and we've got vision, and we've got quite a nice audience. So I think we should probably just make a start, and we'll figure it out as we go. So.
Oh, these are your slides, are they?
Yeah. So can somebody online tell me if you can see the slides and if you can still see and hear me?
Yep. Looks good.
Great, at least one person can, so that'll do for me. I'm used to working a small audience. Okay, in that case, thank you everybody for coming. I'm very pleased you could make it to our third Doctorateness in TESOL seminar. And just to give a recap for those who haven't been to all three, this really started as professional learning for our doctoral supervision team. And it was a case of the supervisors and myself thinking, who do we want to come talk to us? What do we need to think about as we design a doctoral programme for TESOL practitioners? And allied to that, we have opportunities for students to come along and listen to some maybe more advanced level scholarship to extend their masters. And also, because we're designing a new doctoral qualification, I think there's an impetus with that we need to be leading the field, and there's a stewardship of the discipline to consider. So please do check out all the previous poorly administered recordings are available on the Facebook page. It's a different problem every time, which means I'm learning. I've taken doctorateness as the theme from Trafford and Lesham. So they talk about the phrase they use is the difference is doctorateness. And I found this really helpful when I was thinking, why do we want to have a DProf TESOL at St Andrews? It's not just about getting doctorates done and awarded. We want to have an impact on practice. We want to have an impact on the profession. And Doctorateness, Trafford and Lesham, they talk about this as what sets apart the good, the PH done from just from a general doctoral study. And very much our first seminar addressed that topic. It's also what defines a doctorate as the highest level of award. But when we think about it for practice, we're thinking, what is a doctoral practitioner? What does it mean to take a scholarly approach to your practice? And that's very much what we're thinking about in these seminars. So this time last year, we had Maria and Andrew joining us, and that was very much about the impact of PhDs on practice, and in Andrew's case, some of the frustrations of not seeing much impact on practice. And then Maria talking about the precarity in our sector and how that impacts on your scholarship, because if you don't have secure employment, you don't actually have much incentive to be a steward of your discipline. You just do it for a few years and then go get a better job. So that was a really nice setting the scene for why would you take a doctorate. And then seminar 2, we invited Fiona, at the time running the PhD in Stirling, and Alex, who gave a wonderful talk at our EAP conference about the scholarship of teaching and learning and how he uses that to plan his scholarship at Durham. So that was moving us on to think about what is scholarly practice, and particularly in a TESOL context. And today I wanted to take us into a particular topic and see what does it mean to take this kind of theory-based or values-based approach to pedagogy. And I'm pleased that we've got Kerry with us today, who radically redesigned the EMI module, recently won an award for building sustainability principles into that. And we have Michelle joining us online, but just from down the coast, who again is taking this very in-depth scholarly doctoral approach to EMI. And just to preview, we'll be back again in April for seminar 4, where we have Irina and Paula, who have some fantastic examples. I saw Paula at TESOL and was very keen to bring her in. And Irina, we've worked with for a few years, partnership between St Andrews and her university in Ukraine. So it's very much about how do you meet diverse student needs at doctoral level, and in Paula's case, how does working on her doctorate shape her practice working with vulnerable students? So mark your diaries, sometime in April, I'll be in touch. But for now, I'd like to hand over to one of our headliners. And what I'll do for you, Kerry, is start it there. And so you can take your mic.
All right.
There's a clicker if you'd like it there.
Okay, so how am I going to work this?
You've got the clicker, or you can just press your arrows there.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so very good to see you all this afternoon. Those of you here in the room and those of you in various places all over the world. So I've called my talk Doctoral Thinking, but I'm putting a question mark there because I want you to see, if you agree with me, the extent to which the way I've been thinking for the past 15 years has become somewhat like how a doctoral student or a doctoral supervisor, I suppose, might be thinking. And I'm taking as my base writing a new master's module. And of course, the new module I'm talking about is EMI, to fit in with what we're actually looking at today. So Mark said that I'd radically changed it, but in actual fact, as you'll see, I wrote it from scratch and then had to radically change it because I thought about it and I wasn't convinced that it was the way it actually should be. So I want you to think about all the different things that I've done, that I've been talking about, and see if you think I think like a doctor, okay? Right, he said the arrows. Okay. Okay, so when he asked me to do this talk, I thought to myself, what am I going to set this in? And it seemed to me that doctoral students, like MSc students, and like my teaching colleagues, we're all involved in the academic life. So we need to think about what academics actually do. Okay, that sounds a bit rude. What do they do? But I don't mean to be rude at all. So I've put up some ideas about what I do, and I think academics tend to do, and I'd be very happy if you'll add anything to that. So the first thing I always do when I've got to achieve any form of writing or presenting is read, okay? Read and evaluate what I'm reading. Doctoral students actually conduct research, which is not, of course, what I've been doing, but I've had to spend a lot of time looking at other people's research and getting to grips with how people conduct research and the different ways of doing it. So I've been involved in research in some way or other. All students from undergrad up need to ask questions. And I mean ask each other questions, ask questions to people who know more than us, but also ask yourself questions. You've got to be constantly questioning yourself. I've tried to pursue new ways of thinking because as I've moved on through the years, I've realized you can get stuck in a rut. So you need to find new things to think about and new ways to think about them. You need to think and reflect. Reflection is increasingly an important word in academic life these days, and much more besides. So I don't know at this point, does anybody see anything that I haven't put in that is vital? I do have one. There it is. Yes, of course. When you've done all of those things, you've got to write. So, would anybody like to add anything else? Because like any doctoral student, I'm here to learn. Nothing missed out. Okay, well, we'll see later on. Okay, so as I said, I'm basing all of this on writing a new module. But first of all, I'll give you a bit of background to who I am, what I am as some sort of an academic. Then I'll tell you very briefly about writing 2 other modules about which I knew quite a bit for various reasons, and then entering this new field of EMI. And I mean a relatively new field for everybody, but particularly for me who had to write this module. And this really gave me a much stronger realization of critical thinking. I got to consider more about communities of practice because I was a bit lost all on my own in EMI. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the process, which is ongoing. In other words, for those of you who may take the EMI module next semester, it's the 4th time I've done it, but it's going to be different every year because learning always is moving on. And at the end, I want you to tell me if you think this represents doctoral thinking. So a bit of background, just academic background really. A long time ago, I did a BSc in French and Spanish. And for a few years, I worked as a French teacher in the Alliance Française in Nigeria, and I had other teaching posts. I then actually took a cert TESOL, so I stopped being a French teacher and decided to become an English teacher because I wanted to work with L2 English speakers rather than teaching French to British school kids. So I moved into teaching English. I took the cert TESOL and then later on moved on to do an MA in TESOL and applied linguistics. And while I was doing that, I was an EAP teacher here in St Andrews. So I did my MA TESOL distance learning. And then finally, I moved into lecturing in SLA 15 years ago alongside the EAP work. 2 years later, I was asked to write a module on teaching languages to young learners, so teenagers and small children. And then finally, EMI. So that's where I am right now. So how did I move along all of this? Because I think this is important to think about, to consider how my thinking needed to develop. So if we go back 25 years, I was gradually moving from ESL to EAP. And as I moved into EAP, my focus was very much on language. I've always been more on the language side than other aspects of EAP. And I specialized generally in academic writing, where I could really think about language. So then, 15 years ago, I started working on SLA, which to me, to some extent, was a known field, as in I studied SLA myself in my own master's. So I had some idea of what this module might look like, and I knew a lot of what was going on. I also have had, when I was writing it, the advantage of being multilingual myself, so I had some experience of acquiring language, and it's much easier to understand SLA when you are bilingual or whatever. However, to counteract these benefits of knowing the stuff and speaking other languages, I had to deal with the rapid evolution of the field, because those of you who have recently done the SLA module are quite aware of the rather long reading list, and that list gets longer and longer and longer. And I'm one of those people who, if there's something to read, I'll read it. And that's not always such a good idea, because there are constant updates. Just in recent years, we've got, for example, the new Cambridge Handbook of SLA. And this is the rate at which it's expanding. So then 2 years after that, I was asked to go into teaching young learners, which also wasn't too big a leap for me, because even though I hadn't studied that myself, I did have some practical experience because I've taught children French in the past, and I used to run junior English courses here in the summer. So I had some experience. I also have 3 daughters, and by that I mean I'm used to young learners learning whatever, and all 3 of my daughters speak fluent Spanish because I couldn't bear them to remain monolingual. As I say, it's a curable disease, monolingualism. On the other side, though, with young learners, there's a lot less literature. There isn't a massive long reading list like there is for SLA, but it also means that you're writing your module, your essay, your whatever, with less literature to base it on. At the same time, there's the overlap with SLA, so I had something there to help me along. And I also realized that there are a lot of cultural aspects to be considered. So as you can see, I'm gradually thinking about more and more things. Okay, so SLA module evolution. When I began writing it, of course, like any of you, I had to think about what I already knew. And what I knew about SLA was what I had studied and my own experience of language learning. So that was my basis. And through studying it, I was familiar with some of the main literature. And of course, my colleague Kirsty in front of me knows all these people as well as I do now. Old friends of ours, they are. So I became very familiar with Rod Ellis, at that time using his 1994 book. Chomsky, we all know about him. Krashen and his famous 5 hypotheses. Michael Long, Merrill Swain, Selinker with interlanguage, and McLaughlin. And then I began to move a bit further away from these very fundamental writers to Dornier when I started looking more at motivation. Lourdes Ortega, who is a very good writer and really inspired me to think more carefully about things. Rebecca Oxford, who was in the early stages of the big debate on language learner strategies. And it was through a lot of her work that I began to think more and more critically, because everybody around her was sort of arguing about whether language learning strategies existed or not. My final bit of more recent reading is Nick Ellis, who we think of with connectionism, and very recently a book by Phil Benson about spatial perspectives in SLA. So you can see how it sort of how can you say, branched out into a lot of different things. However, with all this reading, this is where I found myself. I was somewhere in the middle of that, trying to find my way out. You know, I was sort of lost, quite happily lost, so I wasn't crying in the middle of my maze, but I did need to find a way out because there was just so much information, so much to think about, so many different debates that I really had to think an awful lot. SLA theory, for a start, as you know, is quite complicated. We've got the cognitive models, basically information processing and connectionism, as opposed to the interactionist models. And in the early days, you know, I saw it as something that was quite linear, but that's absolutely not the case. We see that all of them work very closely together, and it was very hard to get this together in a coherent module. Then had to move into motivation, which was increasingly being talked about, and language learning aptitude, which had died a death but was revived. You know, over the last 20 years, it's come back into favor. Age has become of great interest because of EMI, basically, so I'll come back to that. EMI has made the age of language learners much more significant, and memory. I had to look at strategies and their teachability, and finally, I began to have space to think about some of the more intangible aspects of SLA. So culture, which I hadn't thought about so much before. Language learning is language learning, but actually culture plays a huge role in it. Identity, teacher identity, and finally, because this is actually not a master's in applied linguistics, it's a master's in TESOL, so I suddenly realized, yes, I'd better apply all of this to language teaching. So that's really how the SLA evolved, and I think that my approach to it developed over the years. My second module, which is teaching originally young learners and teens, has had to change and become also teaching very young learners. So we're now talking even about 3-year-olds. It's still SLA, but a very different world. I realized that everybody learns SLA really through adult language learning, but when you come to children, it's completely different. There isn't a great deal of SLA literature for this. Age-related literature is increasingly appearing, so that was another area for me to think about, and I had to start considering much more seriously cognitive development with people like Piaget and Vygotsky. I also realized during this time that teaching young learners isn't just teaching them the language. You have to have a much more holistic approach because you're actually teaching small children everything. They have such a small knowledge about the world that you're teaching them language while at the same time teaching them about stuff, if you like. So I got into teaching children through games. I was forced by circumstances, by life really, into using technology and thinking about technology and teaching, because we're now in the age when you see babies going along in their buggies with an iPad in their hands. It's terrifying. But you have to accept these things and get them into your teaching. I had to learn how to see the world through the eyes of a child or a teenager, both quite different. And as well, I would say, this is, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago, I had to develop a new approach to library or Google search. What everybody's doing now is very different to the olden days when it was a quick walk down to the library, finding books on shelves and so on. Okay, so far, so good. I was reasonably comfortable with what I was doing. I was in my comfort zone. But then, what happened? I had a big wake-up call. I was asked to develop a module on English medium instruction. And I thought to myself, what's that? What on earth are we going to talk about? So I was really walking straight into something very, very new. So EMI, English medium instruction. The first place I had to go to really was to find a definition. And this definition I've got here is the most commonly used, but right from the beginning, it has been quite a hotly debated definition. So in comes the critical thinking. Dearden said, EMI is the use of the English language to teach academic subjects in countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English, which is simplistically quite a good definition, but it doesn't cover by any means everything. And nowadays, a lot of people think that what a lot of our students are doing here is EMI, even though the language outside is English. Emma Darfouz, for example, disagreed strongly with the word instruction. She says it's not English medium instruction. What does that mean? English medium education. And she further went on to come up with EMIMUS, which is English medium education in multilingual university settings. So even sorting out the definition required a lot of thought. So to start trying to put together some sort of a module, I had to ask myself questions, as I said I would do earlier on, questions related to what, who, and where. So what was I going to put in this module? I needed to try to relate it to some form of prior knowledge, and I needed to plan how I was going to discover this world of EMI. Who made me hunt out the leading figures in the field? Who were the people, like Rod Ellis in SLA? Who was I going to go to for EMI? But I also had to work out who the stakeholders in EMI are. Who are we talking about? The where is related to where EMI came from, and trying to locate now the vast number of different contexts. So what did I already know? I know things like, well, maybe I could give you a test here on abbreviations. EFL, ESL, I knew plenty about that. CBLT, or content-based language teaching, task-based language teaching, EAP, and CLIL, which is content and language integrated learning. So how does EMI relate to all of these? What can I take from these? It's obviously closest to CLIL, but importantly, EMI has no remit to actually teach the language. Okay, so on EAP courses, academic skills are taught rather than actual content. I had to think about that. I needed to start thinking about teacher or lecturer development, CPD, in EMI. It's wonderful, isn't it? These conversations that are just full of abbreviations. I realized another important aspect through reading was the use of L1, because in communicative language teaching, we were all taught you must not speak the student's first language in class. In the English class, English only. How does this apply to EMI, which in theory is in English? I needed to talk about, or think about, read about pedagogy in general. So teaching and learning. and I got a lot of wonderful ideas from a book called Make It Stick, which I've brought with me, actually. I've got half a dozen books that you can have a quick look at later on. And I realized that from SLA, I could take aptitude, motivation, and strategies and apply them to EMI. So you can see how gradually I was reading and thinking and learning new things. The one area I have never got into very much in EMI yet, I have to confess to Mark, is assessment. I'm a little bit wary of assessment and evaluation, but I do need to start thinking about that more closely in EMI. So moving on to the who. So the who, first of all, I'm not going to click on this website, but you can do later if Mark shares the slides, which I imagine you will do. That is the Oxford EMI research group. So I went straight there on the advice of our head of school, Owen, and that was a really good starting point. And I found from that that there was a lot of new literature that I was going to have to read. So start reading all over again. Macaro, Dearden, and so on. But then when I looked at the references at the end of a lot of these articles, I was very happy to see some familiar names, which made me feel less lost. And I thought this is going to be a bit easier. So Borg, for example, is an expert in academic writing. David Noonan, you all know, I'm sure. A lot of teaching methodology. Kashru with his famous 3 circles. And then people like Phillipson, Kirkpatrick, and Pennycook maybe, who are very interested in attitudes towards English, imperialist attitudes towards English, and moving on to EFL, which is Jennifer Jenkins' very strong point. And finally, I actually came across John Swales in this literature. So I really felt quite at home again, because John Swales has been around for a good long time. So I then need to look at the other who that I mentioned to you. At first, I thought EMI, yes, it's about teaching and learning. So teachers and students. But I soon found that that was wrong. I needed to think of students, both home students and international, because if you're looking at EMI, for example, in China, you've got the Chinese students in the Chinese university, but you've also got international students there who don't speak Chinese, so that's one difficulty. You've then got the lecturers or school teachers, depending on what context you're in. And I realized there it was becoming more complex. You've got the local lecturers who share the language with the students but are teaching in English. You've got perhaps some L1 English-speaking lecturers and maybe others. Then we have the institutions, so the universities and the schools, which can be public or private. So you can see how I was getting into a maze again with all of this. I realized that we needed to include the EAP or EFL teachers who play, I think, a critical role in a lot of EMI. And finally, I had to start understanding the workings of the Ministry of Education in different countries' governments. So that was really taking me out of my comfort zone completely. So then the next set of questions I wanted to investigate. Where? So where is EMI happening? In Europe, we've got countries like the ones I've got up on my list. Of course, there are many more nowadays. The Netherlands being the first, I believe the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands was the first university to teach through English. In East Asia, you've got countries, places like China and Japan, and all the rest of the Asian countries have moved into it. I haven't included Hong Kong or Malaysia in the East Asia bit, because they come into what I discovered as a third group of countries, which are the post-colonial countries. So where did EMI start? Yes, it started in the Netherlands, perhaps, in higher education. At first for just particular courses, obvious courses like business and economics and marketing. You can see why universities wanted those courses to be done through English. But it moved fairly quickly into secondary education. State schools in some countries, especially, for example, Spain. There's a lot of EMI going on in Spanish state schools, secondary schools, private schools and international schools. And it moved into the primary schools, where some subjects are taught some of the time through English. And finally, yes, I know we don't usually put exclamation marks in anything academic, but I really think it's quite startling to see EMI in a kindergarten. In my early reading, it seemed to me, from what I was reading from other people, that there were lots of great things going on with EMI. People's career paths could be improved. Students who had degrees through English would have better opportunities, but so might the teachers. It was a big part of internationalization. It increased and improved mobility. A lot of the students felt that it was a very good way to acquire language at the same time as getting a degree without having to do both separately. And one of the pros was seen to be diversity on campus. But if you dig a bit more deeply and think about it a bit harder, you realize that there are a lot of disadvantages, a lot of problems in EMI. First and most obvious one is the language proficiency of the teachers who are thrown into this, and the students. Governments that set up these programs or demanded that universities have these programs didn't really think it out very carefully as to how teachers were going to suddenly go and do everything in a second language. Pedagogy increasingly became a bit of a problem to think about. How was pedagogy going to be affected by working through a second language? CPD needed to be improved and changed. Then I got into the really difficult things, the social justice issues, the brain drain, perhaps not so much of a big issue. And also, I realized a lack of true diversity. You can have 60 nationalities on campus, but it doesn't really necessarily mean that you've got a properly diverse, integrated campus. And another thing to think about is the damage that EMI may be doing to L1. So my first set of lectures, I managed to get enough topics together to come up with these lectures, which you can read through quickly. But as I read and thought and asked questions and met people, I began to find out other things. So I went to the Oxford Group's symposium and joined a community of practice, you could say. So those people who are interested in EMI, I was able to talk directly to them. A really important thing to do, I think, and discussed ongoing research with some of them. Then, just before COVID, the British Council put out a large sum of money for people to apply for to carry out some sort of EMI project somewhere in the world. And it made me think about post-colonial contexts, in particular African countries, because I lived in West Africa for a while. And through that, I found social injustice. And this really got me into thinking about things. At the same time, I realized there were a lot of language issues for all sorts of reasons, which English, how much English, and translanguaging, which is one of the themes of next year's conference. So, I'm perhaps taking a bit too long here, Mark. Is this okay? All right, so this is the award that Mark, it's just a little clip from the award that Mark mentioned, the Golden Dandelion Award, which is where we realized that EMI, to some extent, contravenes some of the SDGs. I'm sorry that's so small. It says this module underlines individual and collective actions that educators can take to promote multilingualism as a sustainable way to engage with education and global citizenship. Okay, so students, i.e. MSc or doctoral students, have the opportunity to work with examples of how such top-down policies can have a detrimental impact on education on a global scale. So at last I was finding something in EMI that particularly interested me. And I think that this is perhaps the way of working towards a doctoral degree, in that you have an area that you are interested in and that you need to find what you really want to work on. So social justice became one of my areas of great interest because of comments like widespread proficiency in English is a key indicator for expected economic development, which led governments to go into it wholesale. But in fact, EMI acts as a barrier to learning in many cases, particularly in post-colonial low-income countries where there are heavy-handed top-down policies. And the parents in many of these countries are on the side of the government. They want their children to learn through English because they think it offers wonderful opportunities, but it's not easy. Why did I get so interested in social justice? Because EMI can be divisive, favoring higher socioeconomic status people who have greater access to English. It's exclusive because it applies generally to the better schools, the higher ranking universities, and the opportunity for better paid jobs, leading to a vicious circle where the poorer your education, the lower your literacy, and people remain stuck in the lower socioeconomic group. So this led to my other thing, and you're going to see that the two areas where I started to focus actually converge in the end. I read an excellent book, Linguistic Diversity on the EMI campus, which is looking at all the wonderful aspects of linguistic diversity, but the actual way that it happens. So EMI cannot be 100% English. That is not pedagogically sound, and it's very unfair. All languages are equal. We shouldn't be promoting English as the language that all education happens in. And we also need to consider the realities of EMI practice. Do teachers really use English all the time for everything? Do the students really talk English all the time? And should they? So this leads us into my final point, which is translanguaging, which, as I have here, was coined in Welsh as, I can't say that word, I don't speak Welsh, and translated into English by Baker. The term translanguaging was first used by Ken Williams to describe pedagogical strategies in bilingual classrooms that did not strictly separate the use of the two languages in instruction. That was in the days when the Welsh language was being revived. Okay, so this is where I brought it all together. I had pinned down my focus. What is it in EMI that I really want to work on? So a combination of social justice and multilingualism. I wrote a new lecture just on post-colonial contexts, which meant I had to jiggle things around to squeeze in a new lecture. And I also increased the focus on multilingualism and multiliteracy. One other thing that I haven't got onto yet so much is a new methodology for EMI. But those are things for some of you to think about, perhaps CPD for EMI teachers and lecturers. So this was my journey of discovery. I was thrown into a new and very vague field, really. I realized it was and is highly complex because there are such a lot of variables for all the different contexts. There is now a journal of EMI, which I think once you've got a journal in a field, then you've made it, you're a real field. So EMI is officially a field. What I've learned, I think, can be applied in some of my TESOL lectures, where I am increasingly encouraging students to use their L1 and not to look askance at people speaking other languages, when they're doing group work. And I have to say that SLA and TYL have stood me in good stead, which really means you need to use what you already know. So, where am I going next? Where can anyone go next? I think there's a lot of research to be done out there, how we can mitigate all these issues. And I'd be very interested in hearing from any of you as to what you might be interested in pursuing at some point. So I'll stop there. I've got a list of references that I've used in the lecture, plus 3 really valuable books. Okay, so that's my attempt at doctoral thinking. So you can vote on how doctoral that is.
Thank you, Kerry. I should say for people online, the chat doesn't work for externals, so I put in the instructions to just email me with any questions. I'll put my email in the chat so you've got that handy. But maybe we can take a few questions and comments in the room while they're coming through.
Okay. So, anybody here with any questions? You don't have to type them out and email them. You can just shout out.
Do that too if you're feeling shy. I can start with one, Kerry.
Okay.
So the reason I invited you today is I think you've provided a really inspiring example of continuing to learn beyond what's really necessary to deliver a decent module. You really have, you're determined to be at the forefront of EMI and maybe even stepping over and taking a bit of an activist role, if you like. So how do you find that balance on such a large module between giving everyone the foundations and then kind of pushing the agenda? Because it's only 5 weeks.
Yes, well, in fact, this is my constant problem, indeed, with all my modules. There's so much out there that one wants to share with the students and discuss, and yet you can't cram everything in. Actually, I've cheated a little bit because as well as the lectures that I was supposed to deliver, I've developed this habit of making what I call lecture extras. So I think of something new that won't fit into a lecture and I put it up on another lecture. But I think that this is something that I need to slow down a bit on. And I would certainly advise any of you who are actually doing a doctorate to be perhaps a little bit more focused earlier on. And I think this is what's pushed me into looking at social justice and translanguaging, multilingualism, as what I'm most interested in. So I can put that into my lecture course and let the students go and find their own extra reading that they want to do. Kirsty.
I wondered if you had anything to say about, or to share about any strategies that you may have or have created. I'm thinking back to that maze that you showed us, of how when you gather more and more information, get more and more passionate about things, have you got any strategies you'd be willing to share on how to kind of keep that contained yet be at the forefront, as Mark was saying as well?
Well, I think, as I said to Mark, really, to try not to go down too many paths too far. So I still want to read a little bit about everything I come across in EMI, but try to focus more heavily, or try to join everything together. Because I think what I'm trying to do now is to see how linguistic diversity actually can help to mitigate some of the social injustices that are happening. You know, if we can stop EMI being English only, then I think we're on to a good thing. So I think it is again about focusing, because there's perhaps only one path out of that maze for each person. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Amritesh?
Sorry, can I have a different question?
Yeah, aye.
Cheers, thank you. So I was just thinking a bit about some of the encounters that you have had with previous versions of yourself in going down this path. So, for example, you're talking about translanguaging right now, that and this interest in translanguaging led to you reconsidering some of the things and techniques that you were introduced to, you were encouraged to adopt, and perhaps at one point you even endorsed as part of the communicative language teaching approach. Mm-hmm. Equally, say for example, if you're now looking at a post-colonial context in today's socio-political environment, vis-a-vis the time when you lived in West Africa. So I'm just wondering, what is that process like when you encounter former versions of yourself as a practitioner, as a scholar, mm-hmm. when you are introduced to new ways of thinking about those things? So what is that encounter like, and how do you, personally for me, and I found those encounters to be quite discomforting, and I have to find ways to overcome that discomfort. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, what is that process like for you?
Well, I don't think I find it discomforting. I think I actually find it quite exciting, in the sense that the more I know, the more I want to know, the more I understand. And things that I didn't understand so well in the past begin to fall in place. You begin to put the pieces into the puzzle. I think the only discomfort I find is embarrassment when I look back at some of my old lectures and think, oh my goodness, is that really what I was talking about? You know, so I can see a huge change in how I approach this sort of thing. And I think if I were to find my lectures from 15 years ago, I would see a huge change in my way of thinking. But I mean, I've done this over like 15 years. A doctoral student is unlikely to be more than 6 years, so you've got to go a bit faster in your development, I think. But I think it's exciting, and I think in my own case, it's sort of excitement, passion for a subject. I went into EMI thinking, oh well, I can do this if I'm asked to do it. But now it really means a lot to me, and I read books about EMI for fun. So, Mark, have any other questions come in, or is that it? Oh, another one here. Yes.
I wonder what can we learn from the EMI lecture, or what's the benefit for us TESOL students? Because I think English as a medium, for the teachers who teach other subjects rather than English, maybe more suitable for those teachers. Because as the English teachers, we certainly will use English as much as we can. So.
Okay, yes, I mean, the reason that we teach EMI on this master's, I think it can be very useful for you, because remember, amongst the stakeholders, the English teacher in a given university can play a very important role. Okay, so as an English teacher, an EAP teacher or whatever, you can work with the students, you know, helping them with their language, as we do on AES here. But also in some universities, EAP teachers are asked to help the content lecturers. So there's a big move nowadays to try to get English teachers and content lecturers to work together. Okay, does that answer your question? So I think it is relevant to some people on the MSc TESOL, but obviously it's an option. You know, it's not a core module, because it's only those who think they might be interested in that. Okay.
Just got one that came in. I'll rephrase slightly. I think going back to your communities of practice idea, but thinking about it from the perspective of a doctoral student and those new names and those familiar names, because to what extent can a doctoral student new to EMI break into the field? Do you think that it's a bit of a closed shop, basically?
Okay, well, no, I don't think it is really, because nowadays, particularly since COVID, there are so many seminars and symposia and all sorts of things online. And I've attended half a dozen EMI symposia online, plus I went to the original face-to-face one. So I don't think it's a closed shop for doctoral students any more than it was for me. If you're willing to get up there and go out and network, you can get into these communities of practice. And also, it doesn't have to be physically getting into a community of practice. It can be just through reading. And of course, the other way I've done a lot of this is I've been a member of BALIP for 25 years, and I was on the executive committee. So by going to a lot of events, you can get into a community of practice if you really want to.
Thank you, Kate. I think we'll
Okay.
put Michelle on. Thank you. Very interesting.
People want to take a 5-minute break in between, and then that gives me time to set up my slides.
I think we can do that, yeah.
Yeah, just to get up and move around. I guess 2 hours sitting still is quite tough. And let's see if I can.
Just check your slides are working, Michelle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I can see them in kind of notes mode. Yep, perfect.
So I was trying to figure out how I can see my notes. Oh, that's notes mode, is it? Were you not seeing the actual slide?
No, I can see the slides now. That's ideal.
Yeah.
What I'll do is I'll make this nice and big for us in this room.
I'm not a big fan of Teams. I'm much more at home in Zoom, so bear with me.
Yeah, we used Panopto last time, but they have like a 30-second delay, which wasn't great, and they don't allow externals to make comments either. So again, there's no ideal solution, I'm afraid. We're not allowed to use Zoom, so but
fair enough.
We'll make do.
Oh yeah. And I've got my notes on my phone. Hopefully that works. But you can't see me. How does that happen?
No, I can see you.
Can you?
I can see your slides. That's ideal.
Okay. So I tried to set up. There's the option, isn't there, for setting up? Let me try it again. I did test it earlier.
Yeah, so try moving on a slide. Yep, perfect. Yep. Everything.
Oh, it's a bit slow, isn't it? Okay, fair enough.
You're fine.
That's time to think. The pause.
Okay, I'll just I'll mute myself while you're presenting, just so we don't get any feedback in the room.
All right.
But give me a wave if you need me.
Okay. So you can actually see my face because I can't see that on the slides.
Yep, no, I can see you. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I don't know when you want to give me the nod to start, when everybody's back from their comfort breaks or leg stretch or screen break.
Yeah, let's give it another minute and then I'll just go get people.
All righty.
Hey Michelle, are you there now? Are you ready?
Yep, yep.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank
So what
you.
we'll do, we'll you take however long you like to take, and then we'll open up a little panel. We've got a few people in the room here and online. We can have a little discussion at the end as well.
Yeah, no, I'm counting on it because I want to make it more of an interactive. Well, I would have done if I'd been in the room, but hey ho.
Yeah,
That's the way it goes. Okay. Yeah, so thank you for inviting me. This is very exciting. I'm very pleased to almost be in person with you. And I have to say, Kerry, what an excellent precursor to what I'm going to talk about, because a lot of what you raised, I totally agree with. And the whole social justice issue is definitely a thing that I'm noticing in my research in EMI, which I'll talk about again shortly. And it's also informed the title of what I want to talk about today. Yeah, does academic publishing favour the weird people? I don't know how many of you know the acronym WEIRD. Does anyone want to speak out? I recently came across it in reading something, and then I attended a session at the University of York last week, and somebody mentioned the WEIRD acronym, and I thought, yes, this resonates with me. So we're talking about Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people. And it occurred to me that are those the people that are being favoured when it comes to academic publishing? So we'll explore that a little bit. Just to say that I have published. I co-authored a chapter in a book with my supervisor. So I had a little preview, a little inkling of what goes on behind the scenes. It was quite interesting. And if we've got time, we can perhaps talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, so my chapter was, our chapter was peer reviewed, and we did get some quite stark comments and had to do a major rewrite, which was good because I learned a lot from it. So that was part and parcel of the process. And another thing that Kerry said that resonated with my experiences is the different paths that we can be tempted to go down. And actually looking at academic publishing is a path that I nearly wandered down in the early days of my PhD, because it was popping up in the literature, and I just thought it was really interesting, or would be, to find out how it feels for non-native or speakers of other languages at university lecturing in English, also having to publish in English. And I was curious to know how that felt for them. But then I decided that that was a path to keep for another time. So this is great that we've got this opportunity to come back to it, because then I can explore it a little bit more with you now. Yeah, so the social justice side of it, this is, I kind of can't help but think there's an awful lot of unfairness and bias in academic publishing. And the point being that we're not all weird people, so to speak. But then I'm reading and I'm looking and I'm beginning to see there could be evidence and glimmers of change, and an increased tolerance for non-standard Englishes in the world of academic publishing. And I want to use this opportunity to ask lots of questions. So we don't need to answer them all here and now, but certainly to take them away to think about. And I don't know if it's something as PhD students you've already started thinking about. Maybe it's just not on your radar at the moment because you're so busy with PhD stuff, unless of course you're doing a PhD by publication, then I guess you're very interested. Yeah, so I don't know whether it's worth your investing your time at this point, but yeah, let's have a look and see. Oh yes, and then I was thinking maybe some of us are resigned to the notion that certainly in Europe, we are simply heading to a diglossic society where English is the main language used in doing business, education, etc. And then the local language is used for general interactions and what have you. And the other thing I was thinking about, the fairness issue, if you have a different language as your first language, would you not want the freedom, the choice to write your research in your own language? So these are all ideas that were going around in my head when thinking about this topic, and specifically to give us a bit of a structure for this afternoon, I'm going to have a look at what the current situation is with academic publishing and think about how do we get to that point. And then here we go. Here's the throwing the cat amongst the pigeons question. What would happen if we refuse to play the game anymore? And then ultimately, what other questions should we be asking if this is indeed an area of interest to us as a group? I thought as a precursor to exploring that, you might be interested. I'm going to hope that you are in my research. And Kerry was saying that there's a lot of scope for doing more research in the EMI field, and that's me. I'm one of those people who's doing that. And luckily, she covered some of the points of definition that I was thinking about. So I don't need to go into detail about what EMI is, because Kerry did such a brilliant job of that. But affect is something that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And this is a sticky concept. According to Arnold and Brown, it's basically aspects related to aspects of emotion, feeling, mood, or attitude which condition behavior. Let you just let that sink in for a second. And then affect in language learning. It was an article by Arnold. Jane Arnold is one of the leading researchers in talking about affect in language learning, and she quoted Stevek, who claimed that success in language learning depends less on materials, techniques, and linguistic analyses, and more on what goes on inside and between the people in the classroom. And this is the core of my interest in my studies. I'm looking at what goes on between the teachers, the lecturers, and their students in the EMI classroom. And then back to the WEIRD acronym, I already told you what that stood for in case you didn't know. And I'm going to propose, excuse me, an extended version of that. So could it be that in the theme we're talking about with academic publishing, could it be that those people from an English-speaking tradition, because Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic could include many, many countries and many, many languages, but I'm wondering if it's the English-speaking groups that are being favoured. All right, so just very briefly, the background to my research. The overarching topic is affect in the English medium instruction in a German higher education context. And my research questions, condensed, I'm looking at what affective strategies do lecturers and their students use in a German EMI programme. And I'm looking at the undergraduate business programme, because undergraduate is less researched than graduate EMI programmes. And also the strategies is key. And it was, Kerry mentioned Rebecca Oxford, and you'll see in a minute, she's informed quite a lot of my study too. And I'm curious to see if there are differences amongst participants between those on the full 100% EMI programme and their colleagues or their peers on the partial EMI programmes. So the German system is you can do all EMI, or they just do some courses in the programme in EMI. And then, again, thanks, Kerry, another thing that you pointed out, EMI students are made up of home students, in my context German, and the international participants. So I'm looking also at what the effective experience is amongst those two groups of students. My research design, just because I know this is kind of something that we all have to consider and think about, so just to share with you, mostly qualitative. I've got one survey, so I can throw in a little bit of quant analysis. And I'm following a reflexive thematic approach through a social constructivist lens. And the analytical frameworks I'm using, self-determination theory's 3 basic psychological needs, so competency, relatedness, and autonomy. And then for the strategies, I came across work by Rebecca Oxford and Christina Gonu, looking at meta-affective strategies. So this is really helpful for analysing my data. My sample, I've got 4 home lecturers, 50-50 split between full and partial, 2 lecturers, 1 on each full and partial programme. I managed to speak to 11 German home students and 10 international students. So I'm quite happy with the balance of participants there. And I've interviewed them in several different ways. And now I'm in the process of analysing the transcriptions. I won't bore you with that because it's a long, slow process. Briefly, I can share with you my preliminary findings. And what I'm noticing is that both the German lecturers and the German students are very comfortable operating through EMI. And this touches on exactly, Kerry, again, thanks, what you said about the social justice issue. This does seem to favour those individuals from wealthier, privileged backgrounds who've had extensive access to English language input, and it's second nature to them. Whereas the German home students of different origins, so Turkish, Italian, my kids English, don't have it quite as easy. Well, obviously my kids do, but yeah, they do struggle more than the German home students. Looking at both types of lecturers, home and international, there's definitely more preparation being invested for EMI than L1 lectures. And I'm claiming that this is an affective strategy. So they prepare more in order to feel more confident and secure during their lectures. International students talked about feeling excluded from what goes on extracurricularly in the university, but also sometimes group work in the on their programs. So this whole thing about diversity, there seem to be quite a lot of cliques and groups operating independently, and they seldom mix. And yeah, people generally are not aware of what they're doing affectively. They're not aware of how they're regulating their affective responses to what's going on in the classroom. And ultimately, this is because it's really hard to describe our emotions. So that just gives you a quick snapshot into what I've been noticing initially from my research. I don't know if it's worth pausing for a moment. If there is any questions at this point, just let me have a quick cough while you think. I couldn't make my mouse work to turn on the microphone again. Or you can save them till later if you can still remember what you would like to ask about that. Alrighty, so just to share with you a little bit of the data. So I wasn't looking specifically for mentions of academic writing or publishing or anything in my data, because as I said, that's a path I decided not to explore. But I couldn't resist asking occasionally some of my colleagues what they thought about it. So I've got a little bit of data from a couple of quotes from my data relating to this topic. And so this was a German home teacher on the full EMI programme, and she teaches research methods. And I asked her about, because I was genuinely interested, you know, do they teach the German students how to create academic writing in their own language? And she's basically like, no, we don't bother, completely ignore the German styles of academic writing. And the only thing we do is kind of, this is how a good peer-reviewed paper in a business journal looks like. So remember, these are business degree programs. And then she also said, at the end of the day, it's a research methods class, and the research says there is no German business research. I didn't agree with her, but that's her perception. And they're all publishing internationally. So we want to train them, the students, for that. So already here in the undergraduate stage, the students are taking on board that academic publishing, academic writing, academic literature is in English. And I asked one of my colleagues on the partial EMI programme, and oh my gosh, this was so interesting. She teaches academic writing in English, and she really doesn't want to, but she was the only one that agreed, because all her colleagues refused. And she said this, that she has slides all in English already. She has a guideline in English. They're all reading English literature. So they definitely use the Anglo style, and they don't bother with the German one. But she did also tell me how much the students struggled, and I didn't get to see the lecture because she ended up not holding it in English, which was really annoying for my research, but there we go. And finally, this was interesting. So I spoke to a colleague of mine who contacted a former PhD student of his who's in Thailand. So she's an early career researcher in Thailand. And he asked her about the publishing in her context. And so she fully admitted, or no need to admit anything, but she stated that her goal is to publish with Scopus. And at the university where she works, the lecturers can also publish their paper in Thai. But for my programme, which is relevant to English, I have to publish in English only. Using English for writing papers seems to be more common for Thai lecturers. And these words are in my bold, and it looks more attractive. So yes, even beyond my data, it's the general consensus seems to be English language publication. Certainly in she mentions it there in relevant to English, which makes sense, I suppose. So then I was thinking, then we've got this ultimate dilemma. This is how I see it, all right? But you might agree or disagree. But what I'm noticing, we've got this dilemma where on the one hand, we want to reach the maximum people with our research via the academic lingua franca. And this is argued a lot in the literature. We need to publish in English in order for the to cover the broadest spectrum of readership. However, on the other hand, what about us as individual people, as human beings? Wouldn't we get more personal satisfaction? I say we, I mean, I'm one of these weird people, weirdest people. I can do it in English anyway, and I would not want to do it in German. So what about our personal satisfaction to be able to clearly express ourselves in our own language? So keep this in mind. You might have a different perspective on what the dilemma is in your context, but this is how I see it at the moment. Right, so the current situation in worldwide academic publishing. So I trawled through a few articles and I tried to get a brief overview of what's going on at the moment. I think we probably know intuitively that most of the academic publishing in the world is English, and I don't think you'd have to look far to get confirmation. Excuse me. And I read a paper by Chang 2020 who did a bibliometric analysis. And I'm just going to show you a couple of the tables that I took from his appendices. And you can, if you just run your eye down here, you might recognize some of the names, but the point being the number of citations for an English language publication. I'll just give you a minute to process that. So Chang says, I just took a quote from his paper, numerous studies that have analysed the relation between the language of publication and the degree of citation have demonstrated that works published in journals in English, oh, sorry, I just lost my quote, show a higher degree of citation. So if citations are important to you, you need to be writing in English. Even though, I mean, you can look, quite a lot of these names, one could assume are not first language English speakers. This I thought was quite interesting. The top 10, I mean, I think there was 20 in the table originally, but I just, to fit the slide, took the top 10 most influential research institutions by number of publications. So you got the documents there and then the total citations, and yeah. Sorry, just got a coughing fit. Dry throat. So I highlighted that because Springer are the only publisher outside of the UK or the US. I'm going to have to run the slides and you're going to have to look at them. Oh, I keep drinking water. And I wanted a column for the language of publication, but they didn't show it. And I got this from this website. Excuse me, Researchify. Very interesting. It's the power of the Anglo press reduces the opportunity for other publishers. Oops, sorry, stop sharing. There we go. So how did we get here? So a little history tour. I'm going to try keep going, but if you can bear with me, you know when you got that tickle in your throat and it won't clear, but you can read what's on the slide. So here's 4 reasons for why or how English has come to dominate academia. This is my view, all right? You might agree or disagree. And Kerry touched on the colonialism aspect. And I was horrified when I read an article, I think it was in Kirkpatrick, which talked about how a bunch of British and American academics got together to create this Atlantic Trust with the purpose of going around the world, making sure everyone was using English. And then, of course, we got the issue of economic globalization, hugely prevalent, which then feeds into the internationalization of higher education. And it's all about rankings, right? We need to have our university top ranked so that the students come, so that the best lecturers and academics come. And therefore, the increase for English language materials increases. Well, on the other hand, the good thing is that you have more collaboration across the way. But this all feeds in, of course, then to how come English is the way academic research is disseminated. So, and I read a short piece in Ernesto Macaro's excellent book. If you're interested in the EMI, he's got a book on English medium instruction. And one section, he talks about, how did he put it? Standard English being used in publication, and indicated that there does seem to be a shift in the global English mindset. But then when he investigated it for himself, this claim that publishers are being a bit more relaxed about their standards, he could find no evidence in TESOL Quarterly. ELT Journal didn't go beyond stipulating, please use British English spelling. The journal English World Englishes, he made just an oblique reference to their ideological stance. So by using single quotations, everyone knows that they are aware of the controversial nature of saying native speaker and standard English, but they didn't go on to mention any tolerance for non-standard English. And when you go beyond applied linguistics and ELT to more general journals, and there's no mention of which English authors should submit their work in. But there is a glimmer of hope. So I highlighted the section here. So I don't take credit for this. This came from Ernesto Macaro. And he found that the Journal of English as a Lingua Franca expect authors to submit manuscripts written in an English which is intelligible to a wide international academic audience, but it doesn't have to conform to native English norms. So maybe we might start seeing things changing. And back to, I mentioned earlier how I'd been to a talk last week where I heard the acronym WEIRD, and it was about open access publishing. And I sat there and I thought about this and I thought, could this be an opportunity to get our work published without being stymied by particular gatekeepers in the big publishing houses who are still adamant that any academic article published in English has to be standard English. So this kind of tied in with my final question: what would happen if we refused to play the game? So the paper that I one of the papers I read, Gonzalez Alcade, apologies if I didn't pronounce that correctly, I probably didn't, made an interesting point that the impact factor that so many academic authors are keen to get into journals with high impact factors is an old thing, invented over 50 years ago. and it could be a limitation for non-English authors and scientific journals, does not consider some widely used practices amongst the scientific community concerning the development of internet as a means for the diffusion of knowledge. And here we come to the talk that I mentioned. So they talked about open access publication. So there are ways online. I don't know if anyone's tried or had a look into it. I think OSF, I looked at briefly a few years ago, where you can pre-register your research ideas or your methods, or even, you know, some of your initial findings, and you can get peer feedback. And to my mind, this seems a good way of avoiding the gatekeepers I mentioned. And just if you're interested, the University of York has pioneered or founded this IRIS database, which is a digital repository of instruments and materials for research into second language. And it's freely available. There's no paywall. Because of course, that's the other thing, isn't it, right? We do all this work. We bust a gut to get published in these high impact journals. We don't get paid for it. And then no one can read our work because they can't afford to buy the journal or the article or the book. So open access, I don't know, seems to me like a pretty good way of balancing potential social injustices. Yeah. So, oh yes, there we go. A little bit of extra information about IRIS. And it's doing really well. I think it's frequently used and added to. So I just plant that as a seed for an idea of avoiding having to deal with tricky editors in these big fancy journals. And so in summary, looking from within the field of EMI, I think we can agree that it's understandable how we've ended up in a position where most academic research is published in English. But then how do we address the issues, the questions around fairness? How do we ensure equity, diversity, and inclusion? And ultimately, how much valuable scientific knowledge isn't being shared because the authors of that research are either refusing to publish in English or are getting rejected when they try to get published in their potentially non-standard English? Or should we just accept the status quo and carry on as we've always done? And now I think I've rattled through that quite quickly, but I don't want to keep talking and coughing and spluttering all over you. So can I open the floor and have you thinking about and sharing what other questions should we be asking if this is indeed an issue that we're interested in about how to get published?
Thanks, Michelle. That's only well done.
Sorry about that.
Bearing through. I know you've not been well. Fascinating topic. I think we talk so much about the pressure to publish. One of our colleagues, Sing Wang, has a book coming out next Monday about the PhD by publication. And I'm talking there at the launch. And I think many of the issues you've raised here are really quite interesting, because to get your PhD by publication, often there is a requirement to be in Scopus journals. So we're then given the gateholder role. Yeah, these publishers now have a gatekeeping role on who we give a doctorate to, which is a lot of power.
Yeah.
And also, I was well into my publishing career before I even knew what Scopus was. As a weird person, I didn't need to think about it, I suppose.
Yeah.
I just published in whatever journal I thought was good or would take me. So maybe if you're not weird, you need to be a bit more strategic. So
yeah,
plenty to talk about. I want to give time for questions to come in. So if you're still in there in the chat, I've put my email in the chat. Send me a message. But I had another question come in while you were talking, Michelle. So I'm going to jump back to Kerry, and that will give time for anything to come in from you. Also, if anybody wants to unmute and shout out, please do. I'm sure Laura's got a lot to say when I saw what you were doing in Germany there. But we had one question for you, Kerry, from Tanya. If you now feel you do apply doctorateness consistently to your thinking, and that assumes you maybe not when you started out, What do you think has been the biggest change in yourself which allowed this?
Well, I think, can they hear? Oh, okay. I think my biggest change was really my attitude to the whole thing, that originally I was reading stuff and acquiring knowledge because I had to write whatever I was writing. But I ended up actually wanting to. I just wanted the knowledge for its own sake. So I think that's the biggest change, that I've gone from somebody who's struggling to write like an undergraduate to somebody who actually wants to get out there and actually engage with the material.
Thank you, Kerry.
And just to add on to that, the
Yeah,
EMI is not going anywhere any day soon. It's just getting bigger and bigger. You just need to look at what's being published, ironically. The books that are coming out, I'm really nervous about getting my doctorate finished in time to get ahead of the curve. But it seems like so many books every year and articles. It's a really hot topic at the moment.
I'm certainly giving pause for thought on your should we be playing the game, because on our professional doctorate we've got a bit more flexibility, so we have a portfolio to assess and not everything has to be published in a journal. So for example, if you wrote a policy document in your school, I'm accepting that as part of your portfolio, but you've really made me think, should I be, it's going to have to be in English because I have to be able to read it, so that's a limitation. But you've certainly given me something to think about there, Michelle. Thank you.
Good.
Okay. I see we've got a hand up from Reshmi. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, good evening, Michelle. Lovely paper. I'm sorry, I came halfway into this lecture by the first presenter, so I've got a more concrete question for you, Michelle. And I'm sorry you have to speak to you have to answer my question when you're feeling so poorly. My question is about open access. I want your thoughts about this preprint. I was told by one of the editor, and I attended his introduction to peer review and how to go about peer reviewing, and he mentioned that to save up your back from your when you submit your paper and your work is out there, and you don't know who is going to take on your idea. And I have been a guinea pig of that. And the word preprint, ResearchGate, and these are the areas where you don't have to pay, but you can you can submit your data, if not the whole article, but the data, so that your data you're working with, especially with in this era of interdisciplinary work, where humanities students are using scientific methods to work for quantitative analysis rather than qualitative. Qualitative analysis rather than quantitative. So, my question is, what is your view about this preprint concept of preprint, and the ones you mentioned, are they, where do we have to pay for membership like academia.education, or is it like ResearchGate?
Thank you.
You should be able to search for it and find it. Yeah. I mean, I registered with OSF when I first came across this concept, and played with it a little bit. I didn't pursue it, unfortunately, but it seems like an option for getting your work out there. And I think I picked up with your concern that if you pre-register or pre-print your work, somebody might steal it. And this question came up in the session that I attended last week, and I got very strong sense, because these were a group of people who belong to active participants in this, that it's a group of people who are there and believe in honesty and transparency. And you're very unlikely to get, you might, it's dog eat dog world out there, but I got the sense that doesn't happen yet. And it's, yeah, you'd have to look into it more closely, but I would feel fairly confident. And the other question that came up is, once you've registered and you've posted your ideas and your work, are you stuck with it forever? And no, not at all. You know, if things change and adapt, especially in light of the feedback that you might receive. So it's an evolving process. And the indication was it should be relatively safe, that people won't steal your ideas. And plus, I mean, how could they? Because you've registered it and there's a date there, and you know that your work was there first if somebody decides to borrow your ideas.
And what is your view about paying a huge fee to have your article as an open access?
I don't know why that would be the case. And I know that there is a thing about, and I've been approached too by publishers claiming that, you know, just for a small fee, you'll get your work pre-reviewed and you'll be published in this brilliant journal. And then when you look for the journal, it's nothing, you know. So there are con people out there, and I would be very cautious if you're being asked to pay to have your work published, and I personally would just walk away.
Thank you for your reply. Thank you.
In fact, I definitely echo that advice. And we all get those. As soon as you've published anything or you're listed on any university website, you get endless emails every day. Dear esteemed professor, publish in our journal. And yeah, simply don't, would be my advice. My first publication, I joined a project with people who I sort of met at a conference, and I think they'd been slightly hoodwinked. We did a book together, and we put a lot of work and love into it, and it wasn't, we didn't have to pay to be published, but the book was like £100. Nobody was ever going to buy it. It was just it's just a bit of a waste of everybody's time, and it maybe made some obscure publisher a few £100, and a few libraries probably bought it, but it was a real waste. I think you're publishing to reach an audience, so yeah, we, as you say, don't play the game.
No, don't play the game, exactly. I mean, I know it's all very well for me to say, as a weirdest person, I've already got the advantage of, you know, I'm quite comfortable publishing in my own language, and I'm a reasonably good writer. But I was so pleased with the book chapter that Ursula and I published in, and it was taken on by Amsterdam University Press, and it's open access, so you can get the book for free. But if you want to buy the hard copy, I think that's over £100 or something. So yeah, libraries, I guess, are the intended audience. But if you just want a PDF, which is all we need, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Open access is free.
Probably a shout out there to the White Rose Collaborative. I think York, Leeds, Sheffield universities are all joined together to do it. So they do charge a fee, but it's a university collaborative. You're getting proper editor support.
Yeah.
That's one legitimate example. I've got a question in the room, so I'm going to hand you over to. Oh yeah, please do.
Michelle, can actually see me?
No, I can't. You need to step to the screen.
Right, I just thought okay, whereabouts?
Hey, I can see you.
Yes, sorry. So it's really strange. I'm actually going to look at the camera so that you can see me, although see your face on the screen. Right, so firstly, I love the talk. Thank you so much, Michelle. And I don't really have any answers to the questions that you raised, but I would like to complicate some of the inquiries with which you have perplexed us, as it were. So thinking about the refusal to play the game, it kind of led me thinking about what constitutes as academic research, and just as important, who recognizes academic research as academic research. So what are the institutional and regulatory frameworks that would deem a piece of research as academic enough? And then how all of those networks are actually, it's a really dense web, really, isn't it? Because it's also kind of connected with things like the ref submissions that a department would make, the kind of funding bodies that would seek certain outcomes before they would grant you a certain sum of money, peanuts really, but whatever that sum of money would be to do that piece of research,
that in turn, both in terms of like where you're published, the kind of money that you're generating for your department, will have an impact on your academic promotion. So I'm just saying that the refusal to play the game is actually a lot more complicated. So I'm just kind of, deepening your inquiry, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I was being provocative. And in the spirit of, I was just trying to remember, is it Eric Byrne that talks about the games we play? And in society and in psychology, there are these so-called games that people play, and I'm just wondering if in a similar vein, to paraphrase his ideas, what if we just refused to publish in these big high impact? Because I mean, it's a bit like the university rankings. How are they calculated? How did they get to be the top notch, top rate? Because people go and read them, but if we refuse to publish in them, there won't be any need to read them because there won't be anything worth reading. So we can take ownership of our own research. Sorry, I've been a bit kind of anarchic, and I know the risk is huge. But if we don't, and it always takes the first group of people to start making the change, and then it really happens. I don't know if I'd be brave enough, but
I think to me, and I may be absolutely mistaken about this, but it seems to me that it's a kind of movement or a form of activism that people who are not only in permanent academic jobs, but also people who are high up in academic hierarchy, people like professors, who should be leading this change. Because it is actually institutional, it is embedded in the system, in the industry in which we work, that demands certain outputs and certain types of outputs in order to be recognized as a bona fide academic.
yeah.
And I think people who are lower down on academic hierarchy or in parlous, precarious contracts, it's a lot harder for them to take on this revolutionary mantle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's not in the top up people's interest to shake up the status quo. Why would they? Because it's serving them nicely.
Quite. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we probably need a future seminar just on the publishing industry, because there's some really interesting. I know there's been a bit of a backlash against Nature in the kind of physical sciences. Lingua was one of the applied linguistics journals, where I think the whole editorial board resigned and started their own open access journal. So there are some isolated examples. I just had a question come in on email for you, Michelle. Might further developments in future in automated translation make a big difference in future to mitigate access as a reader and a writer? That might reduce L1 dominance. And picking up on the chat as well, one of our doctoral students, Mohammed Sadiq, has shared a link to TESOL graphics, which again, while it's still in English, it's using graphics and summaries to get the ideas of several articles across. So might that kind of thing, making things much easier to if you're reading just to get the content, if we're not worried about it being stylish writing, we're just wanting information.
Yeah, and certainly in China and Japan, the publishers there are actively using bilingualism. So, and we see it increasingly. You probably have too, articles where the abstract is in the native language and then in English. Yeah, but then the rest of the articles in English. And that's the other thing that they're doing in China and Japan is translating the best of their research, published research, with the intention of encouraging other international researchers. So there's certainly a market for translating. I just wonder, how much gets lost in translation, and it's an extra cost, it's an extra time factor. And if we could just be allowed to write in our own version of English, even native speakers, not all are gifted writers, right? My supervisor's constantly telling me, rewrite.
Yeah. I think
which reminds me, actually,
to read the original Bourdieu. It's very impressive, but I'm not sure it's necessary.
Yeah. But thinking about what is academic writing, I've been enthralled by Giulia Molinari's book, on that subject, and she raises the issue of, you know, who says what academic writing should be like, and then it comes back to what I'm arguing, that just because it's the way it's always been done doesn't mean it has to be the way it continues to be done. And she touched on different ways of disseminating your research through different media, for example. So like you said, with pictures, music, poetry, and all sorts of options. It's just fascinating.
Yes, thank you. And bringing us full circle, we've got a review of that in the latest issue of the Journal of Academic Writing, which is open access and very nurturing for those people who want a bit of help with their English. Okay, that's kind of wrapped up all the questions here. Any other comments in the room? Or okay, so just to say thank you to everybody for coming. We'll of course share slides, we'll share the recording, and I'll be in touch with dates for April, so please do come on there. The St Andrews EAP conference is March? 4th of March. It's a Saturday, and there's also a limited online option there, so we'll have the keynotes, and one of the parallel rooms will be streaming, so I'll send all that information out. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Kerry. Thank you, everybody.